In previous room, we spoke about different kinds of trephis that are on chickens. Time ago, we spoke about trephis that could be in the eggs of a chicken. The eggs even before they're hatched. And otherwise, a different time we spoke about the different trephis that actually would be found in a chicken, with different kind of poultry. And those are the kinds that are would be noticed at the shechita. Today, we're going to talk about three different types of trephis that are, of course, checked for at the shechita also. But it's the kind of trephis that would show all the way that potentially a consumer might see them at home. That is to say, they pick up a package of chicken, ready to eat or ready to be cooked, and they might notice something that would make them wonder whether that thing's treif or not. Again, in most cases, it's not an issue because again, there are mashgichim at the shechita who are looking out for these kind of things. But of course, things could be missed, and that's what we're going to talk about, these different questions and whether they are or not an issue, or when a person need to bring them to ask them a Shailos to find out whether they have a question or not. And the first one is like this. Shulchan Aruch says that if an animal gets some kind of a wound or something happens to it that makes a collection of blood in one spot, then you need to cut away that spot. You need to cut in that spot in order to let the blood drain out during Melichah. So before the Melichah, you have to cut it. And the Shulchan Aruch says, you can't cook it until you cut that spot first and then do Melichah, which is to say, then there'll be a way for the blood to drain out during Melichah from that place where you made it. And the Rama sticks in that it's for that reason that there's a minhag to trim away the makam hashchita because his blood would get stuck in that spot also. Okay, so that raises a question. This thing which is called Nitzar dam collected, which is that very reasonably common that when you look at it at the drumstick of a chicken. At the narrow end of the drumstick, towards the end of the narrow side, there's a redness. In people in Hashgacha call it the Redlegs. I don't know if that's an official name. That's what people call it. And they have this like red, I don't know, maybe it's like an inch, 3/4 of an inch, circle-ish, unusual, this shape of red, what looks like blood. And sometimes that could happen maybe because when the plant personnel, after the shechita, the chicken goes into a cone, and then to be mefarches, just to let the blood drain out, and then until it stops moving around, and then the chickens are hung onto a conveyor belt, hung by their legs, by the end of their legs, onto a conveyor belt. So maybe that's where a blood vessel breaks, or something else, other ways that it could happen, and the question is that Nitzar dam? Is that an example of Nitzar dam? And if it is, then you have to make a slice in that spot before you did Melichah to the chicken, which of course doesn't happen. So one reason to think that it should not be concerned is because, as I keep mentioning, the Shulchan Aruch uses the words Nitzar hadam, and that means that the blood got like bundled together, like crunched together, or collected together. But the truth is that's not the words that the Gemara uses. The Gemara uses the words umtza ta'asmek. Umtza means a raw piece of meat. Ta'asmek that became red. And why the Rishonim, the Shulchan Aruch is based on Rishonim, why did the Rishonim change that and call it Nitzar hadam? Why don't they just call it umtza ta'asmek? What's wrong with that? Or use the word Adam, Shenes Adam, use a Hebrew word if you want to. Why did they switch it to Nitzar hadam? So that's a mashmos. That the only time there's a problem is when there's a collection of blood. The blood like pulled together, came together in a spot, in a clump. But if it's just red, just the redness is not a big deal, and the Melichah will take care of that. Okay, there's such a mashmos. And Shlomo Kluger brings this. He brings his deal that the word Nitzar hadam has that mashmos. And he says that in fact some Rishonim exactly hold like that. They do hold that the only time there's a problem is if there's a clump of blood, like a just some, dried blood sitting there in some kind of a pool together. But if the meat just turned red, then that's not an example of Nitzar hadam, and there's no need to do anything special before that Melichah. Okay, but he says that most Rishonim don't agree with that. And he brings all kinds of proofs that most Rishonim do not agree with that, and they would hold that even if the meat is just a stain on the meat, that's good enough to be considered Nitzar hadam also. And the Melichah, he says, at least l'chatchila, a person should be macher and assume that if the meat has this redness to it, then that is an example of Nitzar hadam. And the truth is, if you look into it a little further, it could be that this question of whether Nitzar Adam means to be stained red or it means to have like a clump of blood coming together, maybe telling a different machlokes that at first glance has nothing to do with it. A machlokes about something called pirush makom l'makom. What's pirush makom l'makom? That is, we've spoken about in the past that blood is only usher if it was pirush, blood that left the place where it started from. Meaning, if you have a piece of meat and the blood is in it, the Gemara says you can eat it. So you can eat it raw. You can just bite into it without doing any melichah to it, because the blood that was in there never left the meat, and that blood is not usher at all. So the Rush says that the only time pirush is usher is if it left the piece that it was in. It was in this piece of meat, and it left the piece to go outside, to go to another piece. What does the pirush be makom l'makom? If it goes from one part of the piece of meat to the other part, it means moves within the piece of meat. That's mutter. That's what the Rush says. The Shach insists, but many other Rishonim disagree. And so the Pri Megadim is a kasha. He says, according to the Rush, what's wrong with da'asmek? Why the Gemara says that if the piece of meat get red because blood is there, some blood got out or blood is somehow spilled out in the piece of meat, then da'asmek you have to do something about it from Melichah. He says, what's the problem? If pirush b'makom is mutter, if moving from one part of meat to the other is mutter, it's not usher. It's blood, but it's not blood which is usher. So what's the problem with pirush b'makom? So Pri Megadim says it must be that according to the Rush you have to say sheyesh harbi dam b'makom echad havi kebe'en. It must be that there's so much blood in one spot that it's as if it's be'en. It's as if it's not anymore in the meat. It's not in the meat. It was pirush b'makom. It's be'en because there's so much blood in that spot. That's how he says. Now, there's another machlokes. That's how the Pri Megadim understands how the Rush will learn our Gemara about aspect. Then there's another machlokes, and that is like this. What happens if when a person does Melichah? They're supposed to Melichah in a container that has a hole in it, a clean manuka. If it has a hole in it, so that the blood can drain out the bottom. What happens if a person did Melichah in a container, a cliche ain't a manuka? There was no hole in the bottom, so the din is that the meat is usher. The Mechaber holds that the meat is only usher, only the part of the meat that was in the liquid, in the blood on the bottom. That's the meat that's usher. Any meat that's above the, so to speak, waterline, that meat is mutter. Because nothing happened to it. Blood was collected on the bottom, so it's a sort of a kavush. Meat is sort of being absorbed. Blood is sort of being absorbed back in. That's a problem. But the meat that's above the line, nothing happened to it. So that meat is kosher. And the Ramah holds that meat is usher. Even the meat out of the liquid, that meat is also usher. And the Shach over there says, Pri Megadim also, the Shach says over there, this is in Siman Samach Tes, the Shach says that the machlokes is totally on this shaila of pirush makom is mutter or aser. According to the Mechaber, I'll say the Ramah easier. According to the Ramah, pirush makom is aser. We're being machmir that it's aser, and therefore we're concerned that blood that's on the bottom, that's in the meat on the bottom half of the meat, the part that's in the water, got moved from its spot higher up into the meat that's out of the liquid, and that's why that meat is usher. According to the Mechaber, pirush makom is mutter. So even if that happened, who cares? It doesn't make a difference. The blood that just moved from one part of meat to the other is not blood that's usher. Therefore, you're allowed to eat it. So it comes out that according to that, the Mechaber who according to this is saying that pirush makom is mutter. He will understand. He will have to say that da'asmek or Nitzar Adam is by Nitzar Adam. There's a blood all got clumped together, like we said before from the Pri Megadim. Sheish harbi dam b'makom echad v'havi kebe'en. There's so much together. It's as if a chunk that's by itself. It's not considered a piece of meat anymore. As opposed to the Ramah, potentially, who doesn't hold like that, who holds pirush makom is usher, he doesn't have to hold like that, and he could hold that it's even by a stain, which is to say that what Shlomo Kluger is saying, that even a stained piece of meat is considered Nitzar Adam, is consistent with what we're saying that the Ramah might hold like that, what Ashkenazim might hold like. Okay, so this side to say that so back to where we were with our Redlegs, these red stains that there are on the meat. If we would say that Nitzar Adam has to be a clump, then this would be mutter, because this is just a stain on the meat. But since Shlomo Kluger is saying, that's Torah says it also, and maybe we're saying maybe it's the Shita of the Ramah, is that Nitzar Adam means even if the meat gets stained with the red, then that's not a tzad l'hakol over here. But there's another tzad l'hakol, which is, it sounds similar, but it's not the same point. It's a similar idea, and it's like this. That a number of Achronim, I'll say some names, Rosh, Shulchan, and even Shlomo Kluger himself say that Nitzer Hadam is only usher when it's Adam B'Yoser, when it's very red. And just being red is not a concern. That's not what it means. Nitzer Hadam doesn't mean is that's a little, this piece is red as compared to other pieces. It has to be very red. Okay? So there's a diak to that. I don't know how strong this is, but there's a diak that in the Gemara says Tzad Asmik. So Rashi says in the word Asmik, he gives a French word. Okay, he gives a French word. And, of course, most of us would assume that French word is translating asmik as red. Okay, but that's not the truth. The word that's not what that word means. That French word that Rashi brings, according to Targum Malaz, stands for ecchymosis, which is a fancy way of saying a bruise. Okay, so why is Rashi telling us that umtzad asmik? So he's not translating asmik. He's describing the asmik, that it became red. He's not telling you that asmik means red. You know that already. He's telling you that asmik means that it was bruised. So he's explaining to you why it happened like that, which is, so why would he say that? Who's telling you that it was bruised? It's bruised, which to say it's not just a little bit of redness. There's a serious, something more significant, what we call a bruise. Okay, maybe that's a diakon. But anyhow, these Achronim say that it has to be Adam B'Yos, it has to be very red. Okay, and the truth is, we saw when we learned Hechastam, that everything that looks like blood or that looks red is not automatically awesome. We saw that the Shach says if you did Melichah and you did what you were supposed to do, you followed all the dinim of Melichah and you did what you were supposed to, the red liquid that comes out afterwards, the red liquid that you see in the bag, when you put the piece of meat after Melichah, they keep it in a cryo bag, all that kind of stuff, or the red juice, so to speak, juice that comes out, that's not dam. He calls it moil ba'alma. It's just some other kind of a liquid. So just because it's red doesn't mean that it's a dam or that it's dam that's also. And therefore, being as in most cases, the Redlegs that we see, meaning that make it to the supermarket, those Redlegs are just not a significant amount of blood. Therefore, those are not usher. The more serious ones, if there's a much more serious amount of redness, then in fact it would be usher, and those would be taken up by the mashgichim. So we don't chuck their own chickens at home and see the ones that are really dead to know, that's the Nitzer Adam. We only see the ones that just have a little bit of redness to it. And that's not what's included in Nitzer Adam. And Nitzer Adam means that it has a much more serious amount of red. And that's the only thing that we're concerned about. That needs to be cut out. Again, in the shechita, they would just throw them out or send them for treif. But for us, most of what we see at home is not going to be an issue. Now, but then let's move on to another possibility of treifas. It has to do with Redlegs also, but it has a different angle of what could be wrong with a chicken we would find at home, and that is, we saw way back when we spoke about treifas in poultry, that there's something called tzumas hagidin. What is that? That is the muscles that are in a chicken's leg and the drumstick. Those muscles control the movement of the chicken's toes. Okay, and the way the muscles control the toes is through tendons. These like long, stringy chutim. We call them in Shulchan Aruch we call it a chut, like a string. But it passes through the shank, the bottom, at the very tip of the narrow end of the drumstick, tibia. And the Gemara says there are 16 of them in a bird. And they all come together. They join together. That's the tzomes. The tzomes hagidin, where they join together. They're at the very bottom of the tip of the bone, the narrow side of the bone. They join together, and then they pass through to the foot. And if any one of those are cut, then the chicken is a treifa. Now, the tzumas hagidin is again, as I keep saying, is where they come together. It's not any gid. It's where the gidin come together. It's a shayla exactly how far up from the bottom of the drumstick is usher. So one etzbar, two etzbars, and some say halfway up. The different shittas in the Achronim. Beis David says, what the Shach says, and assume up to halfway up is a concern. Up to halfway up, if one of the gidin get broken, that's a concern. And like we mentioned in the past that at the shchitas they check for them. Now there's another question, and that is the Shulchan Aruch says when he's talking about tzumas hagidin for animals, not for birds, he's talking about for animals. He says first he brings bestam that the tzumas hagidin for an animal is on the outer side of the leg. meaning to say is the part of the leg that doesn't face the adjacent leg. It's facing the outwards, or the way he describes it as where the tail would fall onto it, the outside of the leg. Okay, that's what he says. But he says that it's on the inside, meaning the part that faces the other leg, faces the other leg. All these are totally in how to learn Pshat and Gemara in Chulin, Ein Vav. And the Ramah says that the Ikar Din is like the first day. The Ikar Din is like the first day that it's on the outside. But you should be machmir for both shitas. You should be machmir for both the shitas. Okay, now, the Pri Megadim, right on that din, says that the same thing is by birds. The same machlokes is on the outside and the inside applies by birds also. Now, if that would be, if we take on what he's saying, that by birds the Shiloh is only on the outside, not on the inside, not inside of the leg, then that would be very relevant to our Redlegs. We'll talk about in a second how they affect Tzumas Hagidin. That would be because the Redlegs almost always, invariably, they are on the inside. They are on the part that would be between the part of the leg that faces the other leg of the chicken. And if it's true, if what the Pri Megadim is saying is, according to the Pri Megadim, that on the inside, the Ikar Din there is no trefus. It's only be machmir for the Yesh Aimim. Then the Pri Megadim also says that if you have a suffix about it of a broken Tzumas Hagidin, then you could be mitzaref this to its svek. They say suffix if the Gidin aren't even on the inside altogether, and even if they are, maybe this wasn't broken. This Tzumas Hagidin. Okay, that would be true according to Pri Megadim. However, Rabbi Kiveger on that Pri Megadim says, that's what the Pri Megadim says. He says, but if you look, and I forgot to mention, the Pri Megadim is based on a Rosh, who says that the same machlokes in the Gemara is the same for animals. The same machlokes about how to understand the Gemara about animals applies to birds also. But the Kiveger says you should look in the Beis Hill and a few halachas later, where it talks about Tzumas Hagidin for birds. Where there, the Beis Hill says is that it's pashut. Everybody agrees. There's no Shiloh that the Tzumas Hagidin for birds are on the inside, not on the outside. And in fact, he says that's what we do. We do it on the inside, and the outside. Some local, we have people who are involved in the Shechita who said, yeah, they do Tzumas Hagidin no matter which side it's on. In fact, there are Hagidin seemingly on all sides. When we looked around inside the chicken, seemed to be Hagidin on all sides. Which Gidin count may depend on the other machlokes about how high up you have to go. Anyhow, but it seems, according to Beis Hill, what Kiveger brings, that the Tzumas Hagidin is a shayli on the inside. In which case, we don't have any kulas to say it's only a shayla, it's only a yesh armin to machor. Okay. Anyhow, excuse me. Back to where we were. So Tzumas Hagidin, if they get ripped, makes the bird into a trefa. And the Ramah says it's hard to tell if one of the gidim are ripped. It's not so easy to figure it out, and therefore he says, if a chicken was wounded in the area of the Tzumas Hagidin, then you have to assume that the gidim were ripped. We're not boidig them. We have to assume that the gid was ripped and the animal's a trefa. So now when we think about our Redlegs, we have to say, wait a second. The first question we talked about was, do the Redlegs, is that a Shiloh of dam? But now we have to think about, wait a second. Forget about whether there's dam there. If the bird got banged up to the point that it was bleeding over here, well, maybe the Gidim were ripped also. Now we can't even check on that because the Rambam says we're not sendach on that. We don't do a bedika to decide whether the Gidim were ripped or not. Okay, but however, on this din that says that when we say if anytime he gets a wound, you should be choishish that maybe the Gidim were ripped. The Shach says like this. He says venerally. He says that we say that we have to be worried about by a wound is that's only dafka nitrar tam harbet shekamat ein hagidim nikar b'nei hadam. It's such a huge wound. There's like blood all over the place, and you could barely even see the gidim that are under there. Apotzirius dam wetes lama nachef kishein roin shemrias b'gidim. We don't say anything wrong with the gidim. The gidim look perfectly healthy. There's nothing wrong with them. There's the chicken got a little banged up. That's nothing. He says because we'd say that shemborn nachef kol boys of game nefuchos tsurus adam afil mad. If we would say that any bird that comes with a little bit of dam, some kind of a wound, some kind of something happened to it. He says that not every bird would be cherry. He says it's not possible that could be, but rather it's only if it's a very serious wound and you see some real indication that something's wrong. That's when you have to say that you have to be choishish that the gidim ripped. And the Pri Megadim says like that also, and he says ein lahashchas mamun Ain lahashas mummy, so don't throw out Yidden's money and make every bird chafe like this, he says. So now, this actually has a similarity to what we said beforehand, that the Redlegs, after the dam shabai is only also when there's a lot of it. Here he seems to be even more extreme. It has to be a really serious wound before we have to be choshesh, maybe the gidim ripped up. And therefore, if there's serious swelling and bruising on the lower half of the drumstick, then you have to have chashash that there was that the tzumas hagidim were ripped. Otherwise, you wouldn't have to be worried about that. And again, these kind of things, the more serious ones would be pulled out at the shechita. It's unlikely that something like that is going to make it through all the way to the point that you get to a consumer. Now, in talking about this, there's a difference between what we talked about Nitzar Hadam, of with this blood that has to be, sliced open, as compared to this case where there's a wound, there's some kind of a sign of a wound, that we therefore have to be choshesh for that tzumas hagidim ripped. And that is as follows. Blood is a concern no matter when it comes out of the animal. But a bird can only become a treifa when it's alive. If something happened to the bird after it died, and that caused some damage to that part of the chicken, he can't become a treifa if it's dead. So, for example, if the people who collected the birds when they were alive, they have to take them from the farm to bring them to the slaughterhouse. They have to collect all these birds together, put them into crates, and bring them to the slaughterhouse. In collecting them, sometimes those people use these long rods with hooks on them, and they grab the birds by their legs to pull them in. If they grab them in the wrong spot, or they grab them too strongly, and they cause a wound over there, then that bird could potentially be a treifa because you did damage to it in the place where the tzumas hagidim is. He said, so that would potentially be a problem. He said, but what happens if the bird got this damage because you threw it into the cone and it banged around too much and it hurt itself? It got this wound, this bruise on it. Or you did it as they hung it up on the hooks after the shechita. Well, again, so after the dam question, we have a question. But after the tzumas hagidim treifa, it can't become a treifa once it's after shechita. It's not possible. So that wouldn't be a problem at all. Okay, so that's an expertise that someone has to be able to see does this wound look like it happened when the bird was alive, or did it happen afterwards during the maneuvering and dealing with the bird afterwards that blood came out? So one of the ways to tell is actually Shulchan brings it sort of in passing is it depends what color it looks like, because if the wound is if it's a black and blue mark, then black and blue means it's been there for a while and it started to heal, and that's why it's starting to look like it's black and blue. So then that's how it makes it seem like it happened when it was alive. And suppose if it's red or just a little dark color, then that may have happened right after, during the shechita, right after the shechita, in which case it wouldn't be a problem. Okay, so that takes a little bit of an expertise, and there's even a shayla about what happens if it's yellow or green. That may be indication of an infection, a different kind of a problem. That might be a tzumas hagidim issue, but need someone who knows what he's talking about to look at it. Again, the people at the shechita who are watching it, they see birds all day long, and they have that expertise to know which ones should be pulled off and which ones is a sign of a more serious earlier wound that could have caused a problem with tzumas hagidim. Now, okay, so again, if you have a shayla, you can bring to a rough to look at it, someone who could tell the difference between them. But in most cases, any of these that would be an issue are pulled off. Okay, and our last group of questions that could happen that we could have in packaged chicken, meaning what you have in your house, is if there's a broken bone. So a broken bone, of course, doesn't raise any concerns if it happened after the chicken had already had shechita. And which is, in fact, most of the broken bones that we would see at home have to do with packaging or processing of the chicken after the shechita. That something caused a bone to break from that. But I'll just mention the different ways that breaking a bone could potentially be an issue. In theory, that could be an issue. And one is, a chicken wing has three parts. There's one that's closest to the body. It's called the humerus. And then if that one is broken within about an inch of the body, then the bird is a treifa. Not because the bone itself is caused it to be a treifa. Breaking that bone, again, it's the closest bone and it's the closest part near the body of the wing. It's not because the bone itself is a treifa, because there's a chashash that the jagged edge from the broken bone will end up puncturing the lung of the bird, which is not far from there, and so the animals are suffering treifa because the bone may have caused a problem to the lungs on the inside. Okay, another is if if one of the bones of the wing breaks, it's not. Then it's not only the wing; it would be the leg also. Then, and it broke while it was alive. Then any meat that's from the break point and on, plus a little area right near it, any meat from the break point and on is also not because the animal's a treifa, but because the animal is because it's considered Ever Menachai. If the bone broke midrabanan, it's considered Ever Menachai. If the bone broke while it was alive, so that's as if that even though the meat stayed attached to the bird, everything from there and on is considered as if considered separated, and midrabanan is considered Ever Menachai. It would have to be cut off also. Okay. Another thing is if a chicken's tibia, that's the drumstick, broke in the lower part, then in the lower part where the tumas hagidin are, then just like we say if the animal has a wound, we're worried about that the tumas hagidin might have been ripped. If the bone breaks in that area, again in the lower half, then also the bird is considered to be treif because of a problem. The tumas hagidin might have been ripped. Sorry. Lastly is the upper bone in the chicken's thigh, called the femur, the longer bone in the chicken's thigh, which goes, it fits into a hip bone socket, and if it got separated from the socket while the bird was still alive, that's called a bokא da'atmã d'shach midוכתיה. The bokא da'atmã is this bone that's attached to its socket. The shach midוכתיה slipped out of its spot when the animal's alive. Then we assume the animal's a treifa. It's not really treifa in every single case, but we assume the animal's a treifa. That would have happened. Now, also if that bone breaks, we treat it with the same din. It's the Ramah says we treat it the same way if the femur broke when the animal was alive. Now, if the bone had slipped out of its spot, if it had fallen out of the socket, it doesn't just like fall out of the socket. If it came out of the socket, as a rule, that would be a real bloody mess. It would be real bloody and swollen and look horrible, and that would be pulled off at the slaughterhouse. The mashgiach who's watching the chickens would catch it. It's easy to see and would pull them off. I guess it could get through by mistake, but it's very rare that someone should ever see that in a chicken at home, in a piece that they get to their house. But in theory, if it happened, or at least in the slaughterhouse if it happened, then the animal would be a treifa because of bokã da'atmã d'shach midוכתיה. Okay, now, in talking about all these questions about treifas, which was our now about broken bones, and we spoke about beforehand, if the tumas hagidin are broken, it's just worth pointing out that that when a person buys a package of chicken and the pieces are not attached to each other, let's say he buys a package of whole bottoms. Okay, it's not a whole chicken, it's just a bunch of pieces. Those pieces are not almost for sure not from the exact same chicken. They just randomly put a few bottoms together into the same package. And that means to say if for whatever reason they decide that one of the pieces is a treifa, let's say there's a problem with the tumas hagidin, and that piece is a treifa, then that piece has to be discarded. But the rest of the pieces are kosher. The fact that they were sitting next to the other one doesn't mean anything. That doesn't mean they came from the same chicken. Of course, if it was a whole chicken, then if one part is a treifa, the whole thing is a treifa. But if they're cut up pieces that are separate from each other, then the fact that one is a treifa doesn't reflect on whether the other ones are.